Margaret had been married to Thomas for 40 years. 40 years of love, laughter, and a life woven together through the ups and downs that come with time. He was her constant, her North Star. They had built a life together, one that wasn't without pain. They had lost their only daughter, Anna, when she was just 10. That tragedy had nearly broken them, but somehow they'd managed to survive it, together. They had clung to each other for support, finding solace in their shared grief. But now, Thomas was gone too. Taken from her in the most sudden, senseless way. A drunk driver had barreled through an intersection on a rainy night and crashed into his car. Margaret had received the call late that evening. The hospital staff told her it was serious, that she should come immediately. She remembered driving there, her hands shaking on the wheel, her heart pounding in her chest. She kept telling herself that she had to be there, that she had to make it in time. But she didn't. She was just a few feet from the hospital room door when the flat line echoed through the corridor. That long, sharp beep that told her everything she needed to know. Thomas was gone. She never got the chance to hold his hand one last time, to look into his eyes, to tell him she loved him. He was already gone by the time she stepped into the room. His face was peaceful, his body still, and she could do nothing but fall to her knees beside him, sobbing into the cold, sterile air. That was 3 months ago. And every day since, Margaret felt the weight of his absence like a crushing force on her chest. She had tried to go on, tried to find a new normal, but everything reminded her of him. The empty chair at the dining table, the sound of the front door not opening at 6 p.m. like it always had when he came home from work. His scent still lingered in their bedroom, faint but undeniable, and every morning she woke up with the instinct to reach for him, only to find the bed cold and empty. The only thing that brought her any semblance of peace was her daily visits to his grave. Rain or shine, she made her way to the cemetery, carrying fresh flowers and talking to him as if he were still there, listening. But no matter how much time passed, the pain never lessened. Instead, it grew heavier, more unbearable. She had lost not only her husband, but her entire sense of purpose. On one particularly rainy morning, as she approached Thomas's grave, she noticed something strange. A little girl, maybe 10 years old, was kneeling in front of the tombstone, her small shoulders shaking with sobs. Margaret paused, her heart aching for the child. The girl didn't seem to care that she was drenched from head to toe, her long dark hair plastered to her face, her clothes soaked. She knelt, crying openly, clutching a small bouquet of flowers in her trembling hands. Margaret hesitated for a moment before stepping closer, her voice soft. "Sweetheart, are you all right?" The girl looked up, startled, and quickly wiped her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding," Margaret said gently, kneeling down beside her. "What's your name?" "Emma," the girl replied, sniffling. She looked up at the tombstone, her eyes filled with sorrow. I knew him. He was a good man." Margaret's heart twisted. She had no idea who this little girl was, but the depth of her grief was undeniable. "How did you know my husband?" she asked softly. Emma hesitated, her small hands gripping the flowers tighter. He helped us. At the orphanage, he saved us." Margaret's brow furrowed. "The orphanage? I don't understand." Emma took a shaky breath. "The orphanage was falling apart. The roof was leaking, the windows were broken, and the city was going to shut it down. We didn't have any money to fix it, so we set up a lemonade stand to try to raise money. One day he stopped by. I told him what was happening, and the next thing I knew, he was at the orphanage with a handyman. He fixed everything, the roof, the windows, all of it. He even wrote letters to the city, asking them not to close us down. And every week, for the last 5 years, he came to visit. He'd read us stories, help with repairs, just be there for us." Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. She had no idea that Thomas had been doing all of this. He had never mentioned it. Tears welled up in her eyes as Emma continued. "We all loved him," Emma whispered, her voice breaking. "He was like a father to us." Margaret's chest tightened. She placed a hand on Emma's shoulder, her heart aching for the little girl who had lost so much, just as she had. "I'm so sorry, Emma," she whispered. "I didn't know." Emma looked up at her with wide, tear-filled eyes. "I miss him so much." Margaret's throat tightened. "I do too." For a moment, they sat in silence. the rain falling softly around them, the shared weight of their grief hanging heavy in the air. Then Margaret stood and offered her hand to Emma. "Come on, darling. You're going to catch your death out here. Let me take you back to the orphanage." Emma hesitated for a moment, then looked up at her with a quiet plea in her eyes. Can I come to your house instead? I'd like to see where he lived." Margaret wasn't sure why she agreed, but something about the way Emma asked made her heart soften. "Of course," she said softly. "Come on." At the house, Margaret felt the eerie silence press in on her. She hadn't had anyone in the house since Thomas passed, and now, with Emma there, it felt both comforting and strange. She found some of Anna's old clothes that would fit Emma and handed them to her, urging her to change out of her wet things. When Emma came back, wrapped in the warmth of her late daughter's sweater, Margaret made her a cup of hot tea and watched as she sat at the kitchen table, her small hands cradling the mug. Emma looked around the house with wide eyes, her gaze lingering on the family photos that adorned the walls. "He talked about you a lot," Emma said quietly, her voice breaking the silence. Margaret felt a lump form in her throat. "He did?" Emma nodded. "He told us stories about you and your daughter. How much he loved you, how proud he was of you." Tears filled Margaret's eyes, and she bit her lip, trying to hold them back. She reached for the family photo album and sat beside Emma, flipping through the pages. She pointed out pictures of Thomas, of Anna, and told Emma little stories about their lives. She talked about their daughter's love of animals, about how Thomas used to make her laugh with his silly jokes, about their family vacations and holidays. It was bittersweet, reminiscing like this, but it also felt good. It felt right. After a while, Margaret looked at Emma and asked softly, "How did you know him so well?" Emma's voice trembled as she spoke. "He wasn't just helping with the orphanage. He was like a father to us. He visited every week without fail. He fixed things, played with us, told us stories. He even convinced some people in town to start donating to the orphanage. He was always doing things for us, even when no one else cared." Margaret's heart broke all over again. She had no idea that Thomas had done all of this. He had spent so much time helping others, and he never once mentioned it. "Why didn't he tell me?" she whispered to herself, her voice cracking with the weight of her emotions. Emma shrugged. "He didn't want credit for it. He just wanted to help." Margaret stared at the little girl sitting before her, feeling a deep sense of gratitude and sorrow all at once. She had lost so much, but in this moment, she realized that Thomas had left behind a legacy far greater than she had ever imagined. He had touched the lives of these children, giving them hope and comfort when they needed it most. And now, in a strange way, they were giving her the same. As the rain continued to fall outside, Margaret knew that she wasn't alone. Thomas had left her with a new family, one she never expected, but desperately needed. Later, when Margaret drove Emma back to the orphanage, Mrs. Walker, the headmistress, met them at the door. The moment she saw Margaret, she pulled her into a long, heartfelt embrace. Both women stood there, holding on to each other, their shared grief palpable. When they finally pulled apart, there were no words exchanged, just a deep understanding of the pain they both carried. Inside the orphanage, Margaret was greeted by a room full of children. They all stepped forward to hug her, their small arms wrapping around her waist, their faces filled with sadness and love. They knew who she was, even though they had never met her. Thomas had told them all about her. They had drawn pictures of him, of her, of the life they imagined she had shared with him. Margaret's heart swelled with emotion as she listened to their stories, as she saw the drawings they had made. These children, these orphaned souls, had been his final gift to her. And as she stood there, surrounded by them, she knew that even though Thomas was gone, his love was still very much alive. And she wasn't alone anymore. In that moment, Margaret made a decision. She would continue what Thomas had started. She would visit the orphanage, help where she could, and be there for these children. They had lost him, just as she had, but together, they could keep his memory alive.